Hey guys, it's Don here from the board. So this video is very different to my usual content because it's not about keyboards. However, there's actually been a bit of talk from some of the people who know me in real life and see the stuff that I put in regards to what I do in the kitchen on Discord and Slack. And so one of the people on the Slack said, hey, maybe you should think about doing like a YouTube channel. And I've had other people saying should do like a cooking type of content or a baking kind of content, because one of the things that I like to do is bake bread. So what I thought I'd do today is I would actually go through some of the things relating to baking sourdough. So I've been baking sourdough now for a couple of months. I created my own starter. I learnt about it pretty much off the internet, and I've been successfully making bread on a weekly basis that feeds myself, my family, and sometimes I give it to people at work because they're interested in checking out and tasting what I make. So what I've got in front of me is the foundations of a new bread that I'm going to try and make, and it's going to be a rosemary sourdough. So just going through what I've got here this is actually not my starter. This is a starter mix. So I've put in 60 grams of actual sourdough starter in here, plus 200 grams of flour, 200 grams of water. And this has been sitting around probably about 5.5 hours just to get it up to actual activity. And you can kind of see that there is air bubbles that are starting to form in here. And this is just getting the mix up to speed. So it doesn't take as long. Now I normally work to a 1 kilo loaf size. I can either bake that as one very big loaf, or I split it into a couple of tins and then I can freeze a portion of it, that kind of thing. Now I like to work with a 50-50 plain flour and whole flour mix. So to complete the rest of the 1 kilo mix, I've actually got 500 grams of whole flour, and then I've got the remainder 300 grams of plain white flour. I've got 400 grams of water here because it's going to be a 60% hydration, and then I've got 15 grams of just plain salt here because salt helps with the flavor and salt also helps with gluten formation. And I've got the sieve so when I actually strain this oil mix. Now, I've never done this before with such a volume of oil, but the recipe basically said half a cup of oil, and I'm choosing to use quite a good quality olive oil here. Very virgin green olive oil, and I've got half a cup of rosemary that's been slightly crushed, and it's been soaking here for about almost 4.5 hours just to get that flavor extraction. So let's just put in some of these dry ingredients. Now I can't obviously do this with one hand to actually get the oil and rosemary stuff into it, but my wife here is going to be happy to help by the sounds of it. So in goes the salt. Normally I just use a big spoon to sort of mix with. There we go. So normally I would actually run with a higher hydration than 60%, but the recipe for this one says to go with 60% because the oil is essentially substituting for the oil. Sorry, the oil is substituting for the water that I wouldn't be in here. People do actually go much higher in their hydration, 70%, 75, even up to 100% hydration dose, mostly because they want a very long ferment period. They want that time for the flavor to develop, for the actual yeast from the sourdough to give more of a sour note to it, to get that bubbling. I generally don't do more than 12 to 15 hours, sometimes as short as 6 to 10 hours, depending on the weather and how fast the dough starts to rise and come together. But pretty much this portion of the video is done, because once I put this together and combine it so that it's all well mixed in and combined, I'm just going to let it sit. And then we'll come back to hopefully the cut, which will be the next section when I start to fold, essentially a type of kneading, the actual dough. All right, well, we will see you very soon. Okay, so we are back. It's been about an hour or so, I think, since I did the other part. I wasn't really paying attention to the time, and I've got a bit of an ankle biter at the moment. So I haven't actually looked at this since I mixed the dough together to form an actual dough. So we're going to see what it looks like, and I'm hoping that it has actually come together and risen a bit, and then we're going to do what's called folding. So, okay, so it hasn't done super duper much, but you can see it is together. It's quite a sort of shaggy dough. It's starting to sort of get that wetness about it. I'm not really seeing much rise happening there, but I don't expect that because it is quite cold. It is winter here. It's only about sort of 20 degrees-ish in our place. So I'm going to actually wet my hands just in with the tap here. So my hands are actually quite wet, and the process of folding is essentially replacing kneading. We need bread to form gluten, which is the stretchy chains, which gives us the sort of that chewiness that we want in bread, but we don't want to knead sourdough because it's actually going to be squashing the air bubbles out. So instead we do what's called folding. And so folding is where we can grab the dough. It's kind of hard to do this one-handed, but we grab the dough and you can see it's got stretch because it is dough, and we pull it up and we fold it over. And what this is doing is essentially trapping air kind of like in layers. So the air that's going to be in between where my thumb is and the top here is going to get trapped as I pull it over. And essentially I'm going to do this a number of times as I work the dough around. The reason why I wet my hands is so that it doesn't stick as much, and I'm actually stretching it, which is helping form the gluten. And I just go over just like that. This is actually quite challenging to do one-handed. My kitchen's a little bit of a mess, but that's how it is. So, yeah. This is when I need something that can be, you know, either head mounted or shoulder mounted or something like that. So I'm just going to keep going around and around and around, and I'll end up with a stretched and folded dough. And then I'm going to end up with repeating that process a number of times, 4, 5, 6 times, with about an hour plus in between to let the actual dough form and stick together, as well as relax, and also for the yeast from that sourdough starter that I've got to build up more bubbles and just keep fermenting away. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop this part right now, do a bit more folding with 2 hands properly, and then I'll do another bit just to show what it looks like once I'm done. Yeah, I'll see you in a bit. Alright, so we're back. I've just done a bit more folding with it, and at the end of that folding process, what I normally do is I actually pull the whole thing up and flip it over. So you see this side is a lot smoother, a lot rounder, because this is the side that's been on the bottom of my bowl here. So it's got that much nicer surface. The thing that I'm finding with this particular recipe is that even with 60% hydration and the oil, it's quite dry. It doesn't stretch as much as I'm used to. So I'm actually helping to keep it moist by just re-wetting my hand and adding a bit of that moisture in. Even though I cover it up with this wax cloth to prevent a lot of moisture loss, it is losing moisture because the moisture is being used by the yeast and it's being absorbed into the dough. Because I'm also using 50% whole wheat flour, I suspect that the thirst factor, because flours are different. Every batch of flour that you use is going to be slightly different, and I did open a new bag to make this dough. So this could be a thirstier dough compared to previous and what that recipe is based on. So you just have to monitor that and sort of just wet it in small amounts to help. Otherwise, you can't just dump in a whole bunch of water. You're just going to end up with a soggy mess. So I'm going to let that sit now, and I'm going to refold it again in an hour or so, and then again and again until I get to a point where I'm happy with where it's at, and then I'm going to divide and put it into containers. So hopefully the next video bit in this overall video, we will be getting on to actually putting that into some containers. See you soon. Okay, so we are back. It is now quite late in the evening, and I've done already a number of folds, and you can see this dough has risen a bit. It has a nice, smooth, even surface to it. I'm just going to wet my finger, and it also has a bit of elasticity to it. It's sort of got a bit of a bounce to it. You know, it isn't fully recovering, but I wouldn't expect it to, because it doesn't have a lot of gluten from being kneaded. So we want this bread to be sort of nice and fluffy with a little bit of chew, but not too tough. This is not like a rye bread, or if you've ever seen that anime series Yakitate, where the guy punches the bread and it bounces back. That's not going to happen here. Now, I've got it on the scale, and you can see the total mass, including the bowl, is nearly at 2.4 kilos. The actual bowl itself is 600 grams, so that means I've got 1.8 grams of total mix. Sorry, 1.8 kilograms of total dough. And that's the 1 kilo flour, the water, the oil, plus the sourdough starter. What I'm going to do is I'm going to divide that into 3 lots. So it's going to be 600 gram lots of dough. And I've got 2 different size tins here. And then for the third lot of 600, I'm going to split them into mini tins. So there'll be 150 in each of these. And what's going to happen after I do that is I'm going to give it a bit of a fold. Then I'm going to separate it by weight, give them a bit of a stretch and shape in to the tins, and they will proof overnight and slowly ferment and rise. And then in the morning, we'll look at actually baking them. So they're going to get a good amount of time to just slowly come up to a good size, as well as develop a bit more flavor overnight. So hopefully, if I'm successful in doing this, the next bit is going to be essentially all of that dough in all of these tins. Here we go. Alright, so I have finished shaping. You can see it was really only a couple of minutes that it took, and as I said, the bowl itself is 600 grams, so there's about 2 grams of dough flour bits and pieces that you can see. That's just scraps that I've left behind. What I've got now is I've got 2 large loaves in different tins, so they're going to come out slightly different shaped, and then I've got it split into small little tins, 4 of them over here. So the actual technique that I didn't mention is where you get the dough and you start with it as a ball, but then you fold and push it underneath itself on both sides. And so it stretches the top of the dough to form kind of like a skin. It's under tension. And you just repeat that a couple of times, and you just keep grabbing it and folding it, and then you switch sort of 90 degrees so that you get an even shape. And this is kind of the tension that I'm talking about. So what you'll see on the skin is it's nice and taut to the point where we can actually see that there's some sort of air bubbles that are starting to happen here. That's just trapped underneath the skin there. The little ones were a bit harder to do, and I had to use water to stop it from sticking because I was breaking up the dough. So this one was okay, but they kind of get progressively not as good. And this was the last one, so it's a bit misshapen because it was sticking quite badly. But I'm hoping overnight what's going to happen is they're going to proof and they're going to puff up, they're going to get bigger. These ones I'm not too concerned that they're going to overproof and spill out into the tray. I'm not sure how much is going to happen with these 4, but I've got a tray underneath them just in case anyway. And yeah, so we'll see in a couple of hours how they turn out. Hopefully they'll get a bit bigger in size, they'll have more time to develop, get some air pockets happening, and then we can stick them into the oven for a bit of a bake. So we'll catch you in a couple of hours. Alright, we are back, and as you can see, it's been about 8 hours or so since the last part where I'd put these into their tins for proofing and shaping of sorts. So, if we have a look, they have significantly increased in size. So these didn't even touch the sides of the container of the actual tin, and that one's filled it up quite nicely. That one sort of just made it to the edge. And for these little 4 mini loaf tins, 2 of them have come out really well. That one's sort of just getting there. That one is a touch short, but that's okay. And there's a bit of variation there, mostly because when I was trying to divvy out the 150 grams, it wasn't exact, and placement if it wasn't in the center, and so on and so forth. The other thing that I forgot to mention is that I've actually oiled these tins with just some olive oil, so it helps with the rise so that the dough isn't sticking to it as it was actually proofing. So the next step, before I talk about the next step, you can see this surface bit here that I'm talking about from the last part. The air has been trapped in there and it's still there, which is really great. And if we have a look at, say, this one, there's a bit right there that's actually a bit translucent, and that is essentially where it's been stretched by the air bubble that's forming underneath. Now, the next thing that I'm going to be doing is, of course, getting to put these into the oven to bake them. But I need to put some stress cuts. So I've got a very sharp paring knife here, and I'm just going to do a couple of cuts in them so that as the dough is expanding from the heat causing the gas and the yeast to wake up and give a little bit of a kick to it, the bread can expand evenly. If you don't make relief stress cuts in it, the skin gets tight as it hardens up and it splits unpredictably, and so you can end up with really weird shaped loaves. I've done that before, and the bread's still edible. It just means when you cut it and you want to cut slices of it, you're not necessarily going to get even shapes and stuff like that for making sandwiches or spreads and things like that. So there's no problem with not doing relief cuts. It just makes it a little bit harder if you want a specific use out of your bread. The other thing that's really important when baking sourdough, at least for me and my experience, is you have to have moisture in the oven. So this is my setup for actually producing steam. It's just a baking tray, roasting tray with the actual rack in it, and I've put some metal skewers in it, and I've covered it up with a layer of water. Now, running this oven at 250 degrees will heat this up to the point where bubbles will form, kind of just like how you're seeing on the skewers here. But it's going to be on every one of these metal surfaces, tiny little bubbles, and that's going to help just continually generate steam as the surface is also generating water vapor. This tray never actually boils, but with as much metal surface as I can get, it causes more surface for the vapor to form against. And so that's where all the bubbles come into play. When I open the door after it's preheated, I will lose a lot of steam, and I want as much metal surface contact there to regenerate that steam as fast as possible to keep the surface of the bread moist so it can expand and form a crust without drying out too quickly. Because if it dries out too quickly, then it limits the amount of expansion that you're going to get. The other thing, just for decorative, is I still have the actual rosemary from the oil, making the oil infusion. So I'm going to put some of that on top of the bread as a bit of decoration. And me talking has just woken up my ankle biter. Good morning, Arietti. Did you sleep well? Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to get to it. I'm going to turn on the oven and I'm going to bring it up to 250 degrees, 260 degrees for preheating purposes. That'll probably take a while, so it'll give me time to be able to make the cuts and put some rosemary on top, as well as let the bread continue to proof a bit more. And the next bit we'll see these hopefully in the oven, and hopefully we can see that there's some bubbles forming on this. Okay, so we're back. You can see I've just done some very simple cuts as a strain and stress relief on each of the loaves, and I put a little bit of the rosemary there for decoration. The oven is now at temp because the preheat light is off, and if we have a look at the actual tray, you'll see there's heaps of bubbles that's happening there, and that's exactly what we want. So it's actually just causing the water vapor and steam to be forming against the outside of the actual tray. We can see a lot of, I guess, simmering is probably a good way of actually describing it, to the point where I know that saturation is happening because the oven air vent is causing condensation, and you can see it's kind of fogging up the actual lens. So we're actually ready to put these in to bake. Now I can't do this quickly with one hand, so I'm going to put down the actual phone, and then I'll pop them in and pick up the phone again. So please excuse me for putting the phone down. Okay, so they're all in now. Now I know that this front left corner of my oven is actually hotter than the other corners, so I've put the slightly taller, larger loaf on that side. Wow, that glass is really hot. And then I've just gone and stacked the rest across. So you can see there's a bit of moisture on the surface of the bread, that's why it's glistening, and the reason why it has that is because I actually re-wet it with just a silicone brush with some water, because it had actually dried out a bit and I didn't want it to be, you know, super dry. So that will actually help also get the temperature of the dough up, and for the gas to be able to move and the yeast to actually expand a bit before that really hard crust sets in. Now you'll see me opening the oven door has lost all that steam that was built before, but it should start to recover quite quickly because water is a really great holder of heat, and having as much bubble and air surface there as possible will get that going. Now I'm going to set a timer for 25 minutes. Did I set the wrong mode? Okay, there we go. So I want 25 minutes with steam, and then I'm going to do 20 minutes without steam, or 25 minutes without steam. Typically I do 25-25. We'll just have to see how it goes. Now I have very limited resource available on my phone, so I can't really record the whole 25 minutes on the phone and do like a time lapse, but you'll just have to see what the end result looks like. And already we're only about a minute and a half in, and you can see the surface, well, I can see the surface, doesn't look very different on the actual camera, has already lost all that water I put on it earlier. So we'll come back in about 50 minutes and see what the end result looks like. Alrighty, well, the baking process is done. It's now almost 9 o'clock, and you can see I've got some lovely looking loaves. The actual cuts that I've done, the stress and strain relief there, has done its job, so they've split as they've expanded and risen, and even these little mini loaves have had a bit of a split. That one, it's a bit darker than the others, and it didn't rise and split as much, but it still did something, as you can see. So they're still very hot, and right now I'm just waiting for them to cool down a little bit before I turn them out. You sort of want to just let them sit for a couple of minutes so that as it shrinks, it contracts and pulls naturally away from the tin, and it helps getting them out a little bit easier. Then they'll sit on the cooling rack for a number of hours to really just come down slowly. Unless if you plan on eating all of the bread in one day, well, when I say all of the bread, a particular bread, if you cut it open, you want to let it cool down and come down at room temperature, because if you cut it while it's still hot, while it's going to be amazing and fresh and delicious and super moist, you're going to lose all that moisture if you don't finish that bread sort of within 24 hours, because a lot of that is still hot and it's still going to just come out and evaporate away. So I prefer to leave the bread that I make to cool down to room temp, and usually it'll be cut this evening for use, for me to pack into breakfast when I have it at lunch, when I have it at work, and so on and so forth. So I haven't decided what I'm going to do for the next part. Probably I will wait until the evening to cut, as I normally do, and then I'll record what it looks like on the inside after I've cut open probably one of these two big loaves. One of these, maybe two of these little tins might end up going to some co-workers who, expressed interest in my bread stuff. But I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. I'm really loving the look of that, and the color is really great, and it still has that rosemary smell. And putting the actual rosemary on top, I don't know if they're going to stay and stick or if they're just going to fall off, but either way, it's just a lovely little bit of presentation happening there. Alright, well, hopefully I'll be able to come back with the last part of this sourdough video, which is cutting one of these open and seeing what it looks like inside very, very shortly. Okay, so it's been a couple of hours now, and the bread is fully cooled down, and I'm actually going to cut open one of these little ones. These little ones are pretty hard. They're kind of like bricks, almost. And I'm going to slice the end of this one open so I can put some into a container to take with me for my breakfast at work tomorrow. Now, once again, I can't cut with both hands, so you're just going to have to bear with me putting the phone down temporarily until I make the cut, and then I lift the phone up again. So hopefully you'll hear the crunch when I actually make the cut. Right, so this is the little one, and we can have a look at the crumb structure in there. It actually looks pretty good. It's a very, very hearty crust because, well, it was quite small. But in terms of that sponginess, look at that. It's got a really great sort of bounce to that. I think that's come out really beautiful. And I can definitely smell sort of the rosemary on that. Now I'm going to put that to the side. I'm going to take out the big loaf. Now, which side should I cut? I'm going to go with that side, I think. And I'm just going to take a slice off the end of that. Okay, so there's the end of that, and we can see on that side it's also got a good amount of bounce to that. We got some good even and uneven crumb structure happening there, and the crust formation around this is also quite nice. So there you go, there you have it. That's rosemary sourdough as made by me, Don from the Board Podcast. Now, if you like seeing this, and you kind of think that you might want to see a bit more bread making, or I don't know, maybe even some random kitchen cooking kind of stuff, do let me know. Maybe I'll start up another YouTube channel or something, but if I do, I'll have to invest in some kind of gear or setup that will actually allow me to film and whatnot in the kitchen, because my podcast setup is not my podcast setup, my YouTube channel for the keyboard stuff is all very much fixed at the desk. So I hope you enjoyed checking out how I make sourdough and what I end up with. And of course, please leave your comments below. And if you are actually interested in keyboards and you've somehow come across this because of sourdough, then please check out the rest of this YouTube channel as well. Thanks very much for checking out the video. And of course, as usual, until next time, happy clacking.